All right, I'd like to call this work session to order, and we will begin with comprehensive plan review process and update. This is just a discussion to be led by our senior planner, David Levitan, and joined by our planning director, Danny Fignar.
All right. Thank you, Mayor, councilors. So David Levitan, and we're here tonight, or this afternoon, to talk a little bit about the upcoming adoption process for the comprehensive plan policy document, which we've been working on over the course of the last 2 years. So a lot of this is going to be kind of overlap with the information that was presented at the October 23rd open house, which we were happy to see approximately 70 people attend, so that was a pretty well attended event. So we're going to go through the process for the next few months leading up to the planned adoption of the updated policies in March of 2020, and then briefly, that'll be a relatively brief discussion, and then we're going to move forward with some of the next steps for the project with a focus this afternoon on some of the housing work that's obviously been a major priority for the city over the last few years, and that I know a lot of councilors, if not the entire council, are ready to move forward with the code work. So that's basically this slide. So we'll move on if we can. So just a little bit of the basics. Obviously began this process in late 2017 following the adoption of the community vision back in September of 2017. This first phase of the comp plan has been focused on updating the goals and policies. The topics, we have 12 topic areas that have been divided into 4 blocks of work. The council's been pinning down the policies by a series of council resolutions over the past 18 months, and we're scheduled to have public hearings with the Planning Commission in January of 2020 and with the City Council in March of 2020. Just a little bit about the public engagement that's been undertaken for the process. First and foremost, our Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee, or CPAC, has been really helping to drive this process. We very much appreciate all the time and effort that they've spent on this. They've had 24 meetings, including a couple of months where they had multiple meetings in the same month. We've had 3 town halls and 2 open houses. We've had accompanying open houses or online surveys during that time. Tried kind of reaching out to with focus groups to specific groups, including Spanish language and environmental organizations. That was done as part of Block 2. We've been trying to utilize a variety of different outreach methods, including the pilot, the website, social media, about our 550-person email list, just trying to get the word out to as many people as possible. We've also been out to a number of NDA meetings and community events. You'll see that the photo there is from a concert in the park from, I believe, summer of 2018, where we were discussing the Neighborhood Hubs project. And then I went back and actually counted up the number of times we've actually been to Planning Commission and to Council, and we've been to Planning Commission 13 times to talk about it, and been before the Council on 19 occasions. So we've been, doing some work. So just a little bit about the organization of the policy. We'll be coming back in December, on December 17th, to provide an early draft of the complete document, the narrative introduction, glossary, kind of images, maps. That'll be coming back before you on December 17th, but it's basically, we're taking the super actions that were created from the vision, and those are creating our comprehensive plan sections. So you'll see on the right there, we have 4 sections that are listed, each with between 2 and 4 topic areas. And then the 5th section will be transportation. We're going to be carrying over the existing transportation goals and policies until we do kind of a separate update to the TSP and to that section in the future. Right now, over the course, and what we're going to be focusing on before we come back on December 17th is really kind of reviewing just the language and the structure of some of the policies, just to make sure that they're consistent and not redundant. Working on some of the introductory narrative, adding graphics, maps, and photos to the document to make it easier to read and to provide additional context. And then, I've had our new planning intern really go through the policies, and basically she doesn't have a real extensive background in planning, so I wanted to have somebody that's kind of new to the topic look through the policies and basically highlight everything that she doesn't understand, and so we've been creating a glossary based on that. So
Yeah.
So a little bit just about the upcoming project schedule. So we'll be coming back for work sessions with the Planning Commission and City Council in December. We'll need to issue the 35-day notice to the Department of Land Conservation and Development and to Metro 35 days before the planned first public hearing. And then we also need to issue a 30-day public notice as required by City Code.
And is that to every residence? No.
We typically don't send it out. We send it to NDAs and to a bunch of other groups. We don't do an individual mailing typically for...
There's some things where we have to. What are those things where we have to do?
Those are the Measure 56 provisions where we're taking some land use right away.
Away from people?
Yeah.
Okay.
Generally, if we're giving something to folks, we don't have to notify them.
Okay.
And then scheduled to come back for a public hearing with the council in March. There are going to be a number of opportunities for public comment. We've actually already opened up the public comment period on the draft policies. We've sent that out via email. We've included that on the front page of the city website, on the project website, letting people know that starting now and all the way through the public hearings, they'll be able to comment. Obviously, people will be able to attend the public hearings as well as the work sessions in December to provide initial comments. I've heard from several people already that have expressed interest in providing a fair number of comments, and so we look forward to reviewing those and passing those on to the council. We've advised people that the earlier they can get us, the more likely they'll be able to, if they get them earlier, we'll be able to discuss them in the work session before we really finalize everything. And then incorporate, but people will also obviously be able to comment on the versions that are presented at the public hearings before the Planning Commission and City Council.
So that December 17th work session, you will bring us the comments that you have to date at that time? Yeah?
Correct.
Okay.
December 17th, regular session or work session? It says regular session in here.
I think it was a regular session.
It's a regular, when I say work session, I mean just not a public hearing. So during the regular
gotcha.
session,
Okay.
but
Yeah, thank you.
a work item,
I just wanted to be
basically, as
sure.
opposed to, it's not a public hearing. It's yeah. And so kind of looking forward, we've obviously identified a number of things that we would like to move on to following adoption of the policy document. Kind of first and foremost has been middle housing. This is something that we've been discussing throughout the community vision, throughout the comprehensive plan update, and that also is being required through House Bill 2001, which was passed by the state legislature last summer. So we just wanted to get some early feedback from the council to kind of provide us the context for how we start, basically the starting point for public engagement related to that. There are a couple different ways that we can tackle this. The state is still relatively early in their rulemaking process, and they're just about to start developing some model code. So we're a little bit ahead of probably where most cities are at, and we'll need to make sure that we stay consistent and compliant with the rules as they're being developed. But we wanted to basically establish kind of the starting point.
You want to pause a sec before we get into this very far and see if there are other questions just about the overall process that we've laid out? And I think the key thing right now out of that open house that we had in October is we were presenting the policies at that meeting and now on the website in the order and format that we expect to see them in the final document, so that we're inviting comments from folks on those policies and not intending to shift them around or renumber them or anything as we drop them into the final document in December. That way we can at least understand what folks are commenting on. But we're going to get into some different topics right now, so I just thought it might make sense if you guys did have questions about the overall process.
Well, I guess that actually does sort of raise a question for me about, maybe just, so the comments that will be brought forward to us at that, not at the public hearing, but at the work item on the regular session, those will only be starting, going forward now that it's starting October 23rd or whatever it was, not all of the comments that have been provided over the last 2 years.
Well, I think that's correct. This is we basically told folks at the open house that the policies, the comments that you give us now, we're going to roll into the public hearing process. We're sort of treating it as if we've already opened the public hearing for collecting comments, but in reality, the official hearing will start the day we open it at the Planning Commission. Mm-hmm. But we're collecting comments now because we're out talking to people about these policies. How does that weigh into what we're going to talk about on December 17th? I think it just gets you an opportunity to start to think about what changes, if there are changes that you want to make to the policies, are going to be something that you might end up talking about later on.
I mean, if what you're looking for is a compendium of all comments, I mean, they've done that with each of the pin downs,
Yeah.
so it wouldn't be that hard for them to pull that into one document, but it would be a lot for us to go through.
It would, but I guess I'm thinking in terms of, what,
We've already done that with.
I know, but I just think in terms of the presentation and the way that it's presented to the public, it's almost like, I guess I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we've been doing this work for 2 years and hundreds of people have commented, and that's the culmination of the work, and that's where we are today. And so now we're saying that there's sort of like this sort of pre-process now before we ever even get to a public hearing, where it almost seems like we're waiting comments that are happening kind of much later on in the process, and because we're being asked now to sort of evaluate these comments.
I think the comments that come in now are really, we will roll them forward into the hearing process.
So yeah, it's just if I misspoke, I didn't mean to say that they would only be considered during the work session. I see the work session as an opportunity for you to review the comments that have come in relatively early, just so I'm sure there's going to be additional comments that are submitted from mid-December until the first Planning Commission hearing, just like there's going to be comments that are submitted post-Planning Commission hearing based on their recommendation before the council's hearing. So these things they're going to be cumulative. Ultimately, anything that's submitted now through the public hearing will be included in an attachment of public comments at the public hearings. I wanted to give both the Planning Commission, just given the sequencing of how, you have a work session with Planning Commission, then a work session with Council, then you have a public hearing with Planning Commission, then there's a relatively big gap, and there will probably be additional comments. We want to give each board an opportunity at, more than just the one public hearing to be reviewing things that have been coming in.
Yeah, gotcha. And that makes sense. I guess my concern is actually sort of like, the work that's been done before this process of, that we aren't that I just want to make sure that we're actually putting this into perspective, and that there's some way to review the comments that have been provided, up until this point. I guess if we're going to be providing an opportunity to submit public comments that we're considering as part of the record, for a hearing that hasn't even been opened yet, then I guess I would say that then we should be moving that start date back much further.
So can I just confirm my understanding? So either we have
That'd be really helpful.
No, that'd be
because
great.
I might not be articulating my
No, I think you are. I think I'm getting there. So a compendium of all the comments that have been received probably over the last 2 years, or a compendium of only the ones that come in appropriately during the public hearing process. But then we need to make sure that everybody everybody is aware that these are the comments that are going to be delivered, and your preference would be all the way back. We create some sort of compendium all the way back that says
Seems
these
like
are
there's
all
an
the things.
arbitrary setting
Yep.
of October 23rd.
Yeah.
Well,
In a
I
way.
don't think it's arbitrary, because it's the first time that we've taken all of the policy documents and packaged them together as we expect them to appear in the final document. And somebody reading through that gets a slightly different impression than as you looked at each one of the blocks. So I think it's fair to, if we had been a little bit more efficient and had our full document on October 23rd, this might not feel quite so awkward, but it was more work than we had anticipated to kind of create this final document. And that has been, so we ended up having to push that hearing date out. So it feels a little bit awkward the way we're doing this, where we're able to pull the policies together, but we didn't have all the extra material to go with it. And so at this point, we're saying, provide us comments on the policies. But I totally understand your point about there were lots of other comments that aren't referenced right now, but they are all part of documentation that we've got on the website, and documentation of all our PAC meetings, and documentation of the other advisory committees that are, or the other outreach efforts that we've done. So that all still exists. It's just
It's how we got to the package we have now, right?
Yeah, and then really, that's kind of those were comments on the process, right? And some of them might
And
not
the
even be relevant
policies.
because, but during the process is what I'm saying. So let's say somebody commented, we don't want it to be red, we want it to be blue. And CPAC went, oh yeah, blue would be good. So we changed the policy to blue. So now that's an irrelevant comment, right?
Unless we get 5 comments that say, nope, we want it to be red. And we've discounted the fact that there were 20 people who said, nope, we want it to be blue.
But then,
That's my point.
then it's up to us, if that becomes a discussion point, to go back and say, why did we end up with red? You know?
Would it be possible to provide on the landing page for the project on the website some links directly to those different block pinning comment packets, however we want to refer to them, so that it's easier for the public to have that, well, maybe there were 5 people who wanted it to be red versus blue, more at their fingertips, because I know that digging through the records can be really cumbersome for someone who's not used to doing it.
I also, if we're not doing the full compendium of all of the things, then we really should be making sure, and I'm guessing you already have, but sending to the 500 people listserv that this is actually the time that their comments need to come in order to
Right.
be included. And because there are going to be a lot of people who think they've already submitted comment if we
Right.
don't go all the way back. So I just want to make sure that either we're very clear to everybody, you have to resubmit your comments, you can send the same email second time, or that we go back and we collect that information.
Yeah, and so, looking back for the different blocks, we didn't get a whole lot of comments on kind of the fully baked policies that were being proposed to be pinned down by resolution. Is generally we would get feedback at town halls or through the online surveys and things like that, that would then be incorporated into drafts. That would then be reviewed by the CPAC, be reviewed by the Planning Commission, be reviewed by council. It would essentially, that was where those comments were being incorporated. I agree that we need to provide, obviously, as much documentation as possible on that. It's a little bit different than where we're at now, just because when people were commenting, sometimes they were commenting at a relatively early stage in the policy development. Other
Right.
blocks, I think specifically for Block 3, actually no, for Block 2, we were a little bit farther along. We held some of our public events a little bit later. So there's been different context to the different public events, but like, for example, on the natural resources and environmental quality, we got a very extensive comment letter from North Clackamas Urban Watershed Council, and we incorporated a lot of those in. We discuss those. We included those as attachments when we had work sessions with the Planning Commission and the council. So, and I've spoken with Neil, and I'm actually going to be going to their board meeting in a couple of weeks to discuss the process and opportunities for additional public input. And so, yeah, well, I think we'll do our best to try to make all that information and kind of clarify the process to date a little bit more. In the email that I sent out last week, or the week, actually I think the day after the open house, I let people know that you can start commenting now. And that was where I said, anything that's submitted by a certain date, we're going to make sure that the City Council and Planning Commission see during a work session. If you're not able to submit it by then, you'll have those comments that'll be reviewed by them during the actual public hearings.
Yeah.
Anything else on kind of the general policy process? So, yeah, as I said, as I was starting to say, kind of really one of our, main priorities, one of the city's main priorities is obviously addressing housing affordability. And we've just been discussing what are called middle housing options or missing middle housing options, basically different housing types between detached single-family residential and kind of multifamily residential, so duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters. There are other types like row houses and townhouses that aren't specifically called out in House Bill 2001, but that, we'll be wanting to make sure we address as well. So just a little...
So do you know what you've got it there. Okay. Expected completion June. Okay.
Yeah, so basically just a little bit of an overview. Cities over 25,000 or cities within the metro region over 1,000 people are required to allow a duplex on any lot where single-family residential is permitted, and must allow triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage clusters in any zone where single-family residential is permitted. DLCD, Department of Land Conservation and Development, has just started their rulemaking and model code process. I think they're negotiating their contract with their consultant, and I know they've just formed the group that Council President Falconer is participating in. So we are a little bit ahead of the game. I think where we're at and what has been discussed conceptually, I think is going to be entirely consistent with what comes out of the rulemaking. I think I haven't heard any intent from the council or the Planning Commission to propose something kind of at the end of the spectrum that is basically we want to do as little as possible. I think there's more of a push to allow for, based on previous comments from the council, that there's more of a push to allow for, additional housing options as much as possible within the current zoning framework. And so the zoning code, the zoning work coming out of the House Bill 2001, cities need to have their codes updated by June of 2022. So there is a good amount of time, but just a lot of cities are going to need to update their comprehensive plan policies in advance. So we're pretty far ahead of where a lot of cities are at. And so we've actually been in contact with the LCD to kind of express our interest that, hey, we are, ready to go, that we'd like to have some early assistance. They haven't identified some funding for, cities that are ready to implement or to pursue in developing work plans. So we've made it known to DLCD that, yes, we'd be interested in that. So we've been discussing this for the last couple weeks and kind of came up with two big questions for our middle housing work that I think are going to be important in establishing kind of where we start our public engagement process with the community. The first one is the council comfortable with keeping the existing comp plan land use designations and zoning districts and moving straight into the code work? So basically not worrying about rezoning a lot of things, basically amending the permitted uses within the current zoning framework. So what's allowed in the current R7 zone, the R5 zone, R3 zone, all of those things. And then the second question being, should opportunities for triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage clusters be permitted citywide? So have it be kind of context-based, maybe form-based, look at, what are appropriate development standards as far as regulating, building envelope and setbacks, kind of take it from more of a form-based perspective, or should they be permitted in focused areas, so more based on locational criteria such as proximity to transit, things like that. We wanted to make sure that we're asking the council these questions early on in the process, just because it is going to basically, help to dictate the engagement strategy that we have with the community. We want to have it be, some kind of clear policy direction from the council as we're developing our work plan and our engagement strategy.
But with that, as we go forward, we're going to, what we develop here, whatever direction we get, we're going to go to the public with that. It may be much different when it comes back to the council based on input from committees and input from the planning commission. So it's just, we're looking at this as a starting place right now.
So I guess I'm confused what we're being asked, but I will just say I think number 2 is the biggest question. And the question that we need the most robust public discussion about, in my mind. Number 1, I'm not sure I know enough to have an informed opinion on that. And I guess I feel like maybe we need a work session on that.
So yeah, I have a couple. On the first question, so I gave just a couple of examples of some potential options for this. So when you're thinking about amending the land use map and then which is implemented through the zoning map, these are not meant to be, represent all the different options, but these are just a couple of options that we thought up. So basically option 1 would be to maintain the existing zoning district, so not propose any changes to the zoning map. You would basically be proposing changes to the permitted uses within the zoning code. So we wouldn't be rezoning anything from R7 to R5 or completely getting rid of R7 and R5 and creating new zones. We would be operating within the current zoning framework.
Which we think works with House Bill 2001, because there, what you're doing is you're adding permitted uses within the zones. So you'd be adding, triplex, cottage cluster, and fourplex to each of those zones. It could be based on specific criteria, whether it's lot size, whether it's distance from an arterial street. There are different ways you could get at that.
But wouldn't how we define the different zones have to change? I mean, because of the lifting of, if our current units per acre might not work anymore, for example.
Yeah, we would have to be but we wouldn't be doing changes to the map. We'd be changing to the permitted uses and the development standards for each individual zoning district. So everything from R1 to R10 would be required to allow for fourplexes, either at least somewhere in the zone, if we go that option, which is the second question, or everywhere.
Right.
It could be that the council decide to keep the R10 zone, but that fourplexes have to be allowed everywhere within the R10. It would just be slightly different development standards, so probably slightly different minimum lot size for a fourplex in the R10 than it would be for the R7 or the R5. And so so that's kind of the first option, is just not worrying about the map, just focusing on the uses.
And so what's the benefit of that? Just it's easier to move forward? It's one less step we have to do?
It's one less step. It allows, obviously, the process to be a little bit shorter, because you can, if you're operating within that assumption and within that framework, you can jump right into the community. The discussion with the community would be focused on where within these existing zoning districts should these middle housing types be allowed. I would also point out within House Bill 2001, it specifically states that because this is a state mandate that you allow for these different middle housing options, they built into the legislation that you don't have to do kind of infrastructure analysis that results from the potential increase in density. So typically when you're proposing to rezone something, you have to do what's basically called like a transportation planning rule analysis, where you're looking at the worst case scenario under the new zoning. If you're not proposing any changes to the zoning map and you're basically just bumping up your densities by allowing for additional housing types within your existing zones, the state legislation specifically says you don't have to worry about any of that analysis. We would need to have some additional discussions with the state once they start their rulemaking process to say, well, if we're proposing kind of minor amendments to the zoning map to kind of facilitate implementation of House Bill 2001, are we going to be required to do all of this infrastructure analysis? It's mostly on the transportation side. On the utility side of things, we're actually right in the middle of doing an update to the water and the wastewater master plans, and we've actually developed a couple. We've been working with Peter to develop some different scenarios to look at, how implementation of House Bill 2001 might influence growth over the next 20, 30, 50 years. So I think on the water and wastewater side, we're actually doing a lot of that analysis already. So I think there's less concerns about that. It's more on the transportation side of things. And, when we do it, TSP updates and start looking at our transportation policies, I think either concurrently or following the middle housing work, there is an opportunity to have those two efforts dovetail so that we are still considering some of the transportation impacts, because that is going to, obviously, a big function of the TSP then feeds into the capital improvement plan, the CIP, as far as where you focus some of your transportation infrastructure improvements. So we want to be having those conversations, but it's more a question of what is dictated by the state.
So to answer your question, Lisa, yes, it is easier to maintain the existing zoning districts because you don't have to go through a transportation planning rule analysis.
So I have a question, though. I mean, R2.5, R7, all of that stuff, the basic definition of what that is minimum lot size, right?
And use in the R2,
Sure,
R2,
but
R25, you can do different.
The main defining thing of it is lot size.
It's mostly
And if we're
lot
talking
size.
about cottage clusters, are we only going to allow cottage clusters that are condominium style, where they don't own the land, they only own the cottage, because now you're into a lot size that potentially is significantly smaller than 7,000 square feet?
Well, I don't think we've answered that question yet. When we reopen the discussion about cottage cluster, we'll have that discussion. I mean, I think in some instances it may make sense to be able to do them as individual lots. In others, they're going to be condominiums.
But will that be, whether it's cottage clusters or townhomes, will that be feasible if you've got an R7 lot and you build 3 townhomes on it? You can't have 3 lots that meet R7, right?
Well, so, yeah, we can establish different minimum lot sizes and different, development standards for different housing types. There's nothing to say that you can't have a minimum lot size of 3,000 square feet for a cottage cluster within the R7 zone.
Right.
You can amend your standards to whatever you want them to do, and basically there is, the House Bill 2001 process allows you to do that without really considering, without being required to. I think the city's going to want to consider the transportation impacts. We need to consider the transportation impacts, but it would be, as part of our process, as opposed to an additional process that, administrative process through the state that you need to do. So, there's different ways to do it within your use table and within your permitted use table and your table of development standards. Basically, you would, potentially create a table, where you're saying triplex is permitted? Yes, but, with a note that says see note 1 for minimum lot size for triplexes in R7 zone. So, you can get very specific, and I think we would want to have the discussion, are we wanting to have different minimum lot sizes, different maximum building envelopes, different maximum floor area ratios for a fourplex versus a single-family home, or are we only concerned about form? So these are all the discussions that I think we obviously need to be a major focus of the outreach efforts as far as, and we need to have kind of clear policy direction from the council on
where to start. But those are code-related issues for the most part. And here, I think that the options were whether or not to just leave the zoning as it is. The second one was to look at whether there were some minor housekeeping things that might make sense to do. And I think as we've thought about it, there probably are some of those that probably make sense. And then the big question is whether the council was interested in taking some wider, broader sweep at making some more dramatic changes to zoning that would probably require some sort of transportation planning rule analysis.
And I would say, just for context, so the city of Minneapolis, they just, I think last week, finally did approve. They still need to do a lot of their zoning code work to, establish some of their standards related to height. But they didn't do major changes to the zoning districts. They basically said that you need to allow a duplex or a triplex on any lot where a single-family residence was permitted. So they took I think they had some minor amendments, and they're proposing as part of their kind of 20 to 50-year planning to change some areas. But large parts of the city, they actually left as is. It basically became kind of more form-based code where you could have up to a triplex on, their equivalent of a 5,000 square foot R5 lot. Now you could do a triplex on that lot where you used to only be able to do a single-family residence. So there's different ways of doing it, and that's what we wanted to present. The more you start, discussing potential amendments to both the land use map and the comp plan and with the zoning map, it obviously extends the process. You would want to have discussions, more discussions with the community. And so we wanted to get some early guidance from the council on that.
And I think each one of these is definitely a higher level of effort as you go down from option 1 to option 3.
Is there any difference in a city-led transportation impact study versus one that the state would require, or are they basically identical?
Well, I think let me describe what that process is, I guess. The transportation planning rule is administrative rule that is part of statewide planning goal 12, and that rule sets out the analysis process that local governments are supposed to go through whenever there is a plan amendment, major plan amendment, or a major zone change. So, the basic factor is whether you're having an impact on the state transportation system, and then how are you going to mitigate for that? And it's just so you end up having to look at some of the intersections, some of the different. So there's background work that needs to be done in order to be able to make that adjustment. You have to look at kind of the number of trips that you might be generating in addition to what the baseline trips are. Generally for development today, like for any development project that comes in, you don't have to do a transportation planning rule analysis because that was assumed to have been done when that property was zoned that way. So difference being the Monroe Street apartments, there's no transportation planning rule analysis. There is a transportation impact study that we require, but it's not looking at the overall impact on the system. It's looking at impacts directly on the streets that it abuts.
Okay. Thank you.
Just,
So,
can I ask a really quick clarifying question about
Yeah.
something that you said kind of right in the middle of that, which was the word major? Is this actually considered major? I mean, because we're talking about middle housing, we're not actually talking, no one, I don't think, has ever considered that what we're talking about here is changing any parts to high density versus what they're.
I think this would definitely be major in that it could result in a lot of change over time. When I said that, that's not necessarily part of the rule, major or minor, in there.
Okay.
But there's ways you can, I don't know if sidestep's the right word I want to use, but there's ways you can minimize the amount of work you want to do if it is a minor amendment. Let me give an example. When we did the amendments for Central Milwaukee a number of years ago, we justified the changes not going through a major extensive analysis. What we were basically doing were allowing mixed use in some of the commercial areas, and the commercial areas were the ones that would have the greatest impact on the system, like a Home Depot or any other kind of big box use like that. Those were permitted uses. We were sort of taking some of those uses away and adding housing where you're assuming shorter trips and less impacts. So we basically we didn't go into a real extensive analysis, but the overall impact that we were describing would be minor on the system, and we were able to do it that way, as opposed to a very extensive land
And
use.
so is it relative to the current, I mean, because don't we technically allow duplexes already in most?
Oh, I think the duplex question is pretty straightforward, pretty simple.
I suppose what my
It's
question
the-
then is it
it's the
relative to the current
fourplex.
zoning, what you're currently allowed, that triggers whether or not, this state mandated?
Correct. So if we were proposing all these changes outside of the context of House Bill 2001, and all of a sudden we were just saying we'd like to allow up to fourplexes, and especially if we said we would like to allow up to fourplexes on a 5,000 square foot lot in the R5 zone, which is the same minimum lot size as a single family home, your worst case scenario trip generation rates for a fourplex is obviously much higher. And so you're going to need to do your TPR analysis. Even if you're not really changing the zoning map, it's still considered, a zoning change because it's an amendment to your zoning code. And so you would need to look at that and kind of do your analysis. So House Bill 2001 specifically says you don't have to do that if you're making these changes to meet the requirements of House Bill 2001. I think it still is definitely, you want to be looking at worst case scenarios just so it's obviously hard to estimate, no matter what you permit, no matter which option you go, how much of this actually gets built. It's obviously up largely to the private market. But yeah, if it weren't for House Bill 2001 and we were proposing all these changes, we would need to go through the process.
Okay.
Timing on this is another issue. If we go through the House Bill 2001 process first and look at some of our code work, and we assess this perhaps during the transportation planning rule process, where there might be a desire at a later time to consider some upzones, that might be something to talk about during the transportation planning rule analysis. The transportation systems plan update. I'm not sure what I said there a second ago, but what I meant to say, but I will restate what I was trying to say. that it's possible that if we wanted to look at some bigger land use changes, we could do that during the transportation systems plan update that we want to do in the future. So that would give us an opportunity to do that bigger impact study at the time we might be up zoning some things along corridors.
So if we're only 7 months away from clarity, or 8 months away from clarity on what the state's really going to require, because I think 2001 does leave some ambiguity. Should we be, I mean, we could be engaging in the question,
Yeah.
the public question of, but I mean, should we be trying to press for too far along that road if we're only 8 months from from some clarity? Should we be moving some other things up and doing them first? Are there some lower hanging fruit we should be doing first to let the state process play out? I mean, I'd hate for us to spend the first 6 months of 2020 putting a lot of work on this and then have it not be consistent with where the state goes.
I don't think anything we're talking about is going to be less than what the state's going to require. And there's not going to be anything that the state's going to say that's going to say, you can't do more than this.
Well, I guess maybe the way I sort of think about your question is that, the real risk is, because, I mean, I think I agree with you if you're talking about this council, but, what if we spend 6 months, soliciting comments and, getting a lot of energy around things that ultimately will not be allowed because HB 2001 rules come out and say, you haven't gone far enough. I guess that to me is where the greater risk lies.
Well, I tend to think
I think
that
yes.
the state law is vague enough in a way. It says allow these in the zone, allow these types of uses in the zone. And I expect what the rule is going to be dealing with is some of the work will focus on the model code and what.
Probably, I would expect. I'm hoping to get some clarity on what reasonable means.
Yeah.
So, that's where I find ambiguity in the law. And I'm hoping that, any rules are going to address some of that language.
Yeah, and
Where we could potentially fall into a problem where we've got 6 months of outreach that we've got to sort of redo.
Right.
I think it did largely depends on how aggressive the council is wanting to be and how, how much, on things like lot size you're going, initial thoughts are that you're going to want to require. I think that the reasonable and, a lot of the other items that are going to be addressed through the rulemaking process are way down at the spectrum of communities that are not exactly on board with House Bill 2001, and there are a number of them, that to make sure that if they had a similar district, a similar R5 district as Milwaukee, that they wouldn't say that you can do a fourplex on one 20,000 square foot R5 zoned parcel directly adjacent to light rail. I think that that's what rulemaking is. I mean, it's going to be the focus on that, and to make sure that people aren't essentially creating, defunct exclusionary zoning by only allowing it on such a limited basis that it's worthless. From initial discussions, I don't think that that's where this council is at. And so I think there's less concern about, moving forward. We also, we have been in contact with the state. We're going to be inviting DLCD representatives to come and speak to you. They're starting to arrange some kind of larger kind of county-wide forums on this topic. And so it's hard to say where exactly the rulemaking will go, but I don't have real concerns about, based on, the community feedback that we've gotten through the vision, through the comp plan update, through all of our focus and all of our work on housing affordability, that we're really at risk of not complying.
So if we resolve the question of on every lot versus in targeted areas, on hubs and spokes or whatever we would call it, would that answer change your thoughts on any of these?
I think you need to look at it cumulatively. So if you're especially looking at option 3, and then for question 1, and then for question 2, you're talking about allowing it everywhere, that obviously has a much larger cumulative effect and is going to require a much larger discussion with the community. If, say, hypothetically, if R10 went away and became R7, or R7 became R5, plus you're saying that we're going to allow for a fourplex on every R5 lot, that obviously has a much larger impact than if you're not doing any zoning map amendments and, if you're doing one or the other when it comes to question 1 and question 2. And so I don't have any suggestions. I mean, I wanted to offer up the two different kind of distinct questions that obviously are interrelated that you need to be considering as you kind of discuss where we kind of establish our initial efforts related to this topic. But yeah, they do influence one another. So.
But you don't see, is one the logical precursor of the other?
I think you could do 3 later, is one thought here. And 1 and 2 are, with 2, there's a level of how far you want to go. There's some things that we've thought about that seem sort of obvious, which is like clean up. There's the R25 zone, for example, is on like maybe 4 lots, 6 lots, something like that. Do we really need a zone for 6 lots? The R5, there is a single plan designation for the R5 zone. Does that really make sense? We're not sure. Do we want to we have 4 residential plan designations today, and we have, what, about 8 zones?
Yeah. 9 zones, I believe.
Yeah, so...
one of those designations, the moderate density, is only implemented through the R5, which operates more like a single-family zone. So on the comp plan side of things, it doesn't, we have 4 residential land use designations when we probably only need 3. And then, for example, R2, R2.5, and R3 are quote-unquote medium-density residential zoning districts, but they don't allow for anything beyond duplexes right now. Obviously, we're going to need to change that, but, do we want to allow multifamily by right in those areas that are currently allowed, that are currently designated R2.5 or R3? Because that, small garden apartments and things like that are considered multifamily even beyond middle housing, in most cases when you look at a map, seem appropriate for those zones, but they're not currently permitted.
And within the low density plan designation, we're going to have more types of housing that are allowed. And so it might make sense to just take that R5 zone and merge it with the other low-density districts and expand the range of densities that are allowed in the low-density area, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there's going to need to, one of the things that's going to need to come out of rulemaking from DLCD and in consultation with Metro is the whole concept of minimum and maximum density within zoning districts, because right now you need a minimum density of 80% of maximum. That's within Metro's functional plan. But when you start allowing duplexes on the exact same lot as a single-family residence, that basically just makes your minimum density calculations essentially, they're moot. They basically are worthless because you're automatically doubling the permitted maximum density because you can do a duplex on any lot. And so there's going to need to be discussions around things like that. And so there are some kind of associated items that we're going to need to be thinking about.
That said, sort of whatever we come up with as a first draft on this stuff, they're probably going to be, in subsequent years, there are going to be little tweaks that are probably going to be needed. The idea that you get, we're going to come up with something that's perfect when we complete this work is probably not accurate.
Well, and I think the state's going to keep, state's going to keep pushing too. So, but I still guess I don't understand the map question versus the infill, every lot or or select lots. Is there any logic to which goes first, or are they going hand in hand, or?
In a perfect world, you might want to do the map work first.
Okay.
But we aren't living in a perfect world. That would mean, and I think the map work is really complicated. I think it's going to take a lot of public involvement. If there is interest in trying to get some of these housing fixes done, we've been talking about them a really long time, it probably makes sense to start some code work and get some things finished in that arena, and maybe come back to some of the bigger picture zone change things later.
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits of doing the code work first is kind of, it's essentially like a toe in the water before you consider, you want to see, not that you're going to see immediate impacts when the permitted uses change to allow for fourplexes, but it's kind of, you're essentially limiting your changes to just the permitted uses as opposed to having, this wide-scale discussion of potential upzoning, rezoning as well. So I see it as an opportunity to take kind of that first step, kind of take a breath, see, what happens with the housing market. Obviously you don't know how long it's going to take to actually be, on the ground, but I think that would be one of the benefits, is to kind of take that step within the existing zoning framework that's been on the books in Milwaukee for, a long time. And that's really the mandate from the state is, it doesn't require you to do any map work. It requires you to update your zoning code.
So would it be, I'm trying to figure out the distinctions in terms of the amount of time. If we're sticking with an option 1 or an option 2, would it be fair to say we're looking at a process that's within a month's sort of time frame? And if we look at map tweaks, that moves us to more like a year? That's sort of what I'm reading between the lines in the description you're giving of the differences between those two different.
The level of effort?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
And capacity is a question I have.
Option 3 is at least a year-long process, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Option 2 is not. Option 2 is it sort of depends on how far we go in the housekeeping stuff, but I mean, some of them are pretty straightforward. Like I think the taking care of the R2.5
Right.
is not an issue, not a hard issue.
Right.
If we don't touch the zoning districts at all, it's just an easier. It's just that much easier. But I think there's some ability to touch them without complicating things very much.
Denny, if we take on, as example, under option 2, the R2, R2.5, and R3, do we have to go through the additional studies that are mandated by state law? And does that add that kind of time, or is that only with option 3?
Well, I think for the R2.5, I mean, if we were just doing the R2.5, like I said, there were some minor types of adjustments that you can do that wouldn't necessarily trigger a really extensive analysis. I mean, we're talking again about 4 or 6 lots. I can't remember how many are zoned that way. The incremental increase, if we rezone the R25 R2, the incremental increase is so small that it probably isn't going to make any difference. We probably wouldn't have to do anything.
So it would be moot.
Right? Yeah.
Okay.
I'm trying to think about the balance between making sure we have good public process and community engagement, and the part where there's a housing crisis that we're trying to address, and I hear you wrestling with the same tensions and what you've heard from us direction-wise so far.
So option 1 gets us to code writing faster.
Correct.
So, I kind of like that toe in the water idea, as long as we think our code writing is, gonna not be, we're not wasting time vis-a-vis what's being done on 2001 on the state model code.
Yeah, and I mean, we can, we're going to be coming back on November 19th, and so we will have some additional time to discuss this, but I mean, if we have any type of early direction, we can run that by, DLCD. Denny and I, know the staff at DLCD pretty well, and have been in communication with them. I think that they would be willing to provide some early guidance. Obviously, you don't know what the rules are going to be until they're written, but if we have general ideas, I think that they're going to need to go into the rulemaking process with some assumptions about the potential range of what they're going to require. I don't see them coming out of it and being incredibly prescriptive, because they're going to write some model code. Even the model code, I'm going to be interested to see what it looks like, because the Milwaukees and Beavertons and Greshams, inner ring suburbs of Portland, are completely different than Medford or Ashland, which also need to do this, just given their size.
And it's been a while, but my understanding from when HB 2001 was being discussed in the legislature, and we were asking to make sure that there was some funding in there for support for developing model code, my understanding was that the state was looking for partnership to get that right, not that it was going to be handing it down from on high. So the part where we're at the ready right now implies to me that we have an opportunity to be at the table in a really unique and powerful way in a lot of ways. So I guess I'm not super concerned about what the state might do and whether or not it's going to put the kibosh on whatever conversations we have in our community. I think it will only inform the process that goes on statewide.
I think we will also have some information by the time we ask you to adopt. So if something drastic happens, we can have a discussion at that time. So that's one piece. The second piece of this is it means waiting. And I haven't heard from all of you that you really want to sit on this. So my concern has been, I can't guarantee a state process. State processes are far bigger and longer than ours. Yeah. We can control ours, and I think that it's time. We have community members wanting to talk about this. We have people ready to talk about this. It's the right time based on our completion of the comp plan. I think staff's handed you a good way to double check with the state and to just stay in the loop. I'd strongly recommend that we go. Mm-hmm. I mean, choose an option, but let's not sit and wait. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I definitely wasn't suggesting sitting and waiting. I think, frankly, if we went with either option 1 or 2, and we're concurrently having the conversation about every lot versus, to me, that's 6 months of work right there. That's not, I mean, the state will be pretty close to done if they stick to their timeline by the time we go through that.
Well, let's not be too optimistic here.
So can I tap into something you just said? So if what I'm hearing you say is you'd actually like us to take both options out to the community, we can, but that is part of what we're asking the council. Do you already have a place where you'd like us to start from in our communication out to the public? If not, great. Then I think, yes, we have 2 alternatives that we could present. But if you'd like us to start in a specific place, we'd like to know that. You don't have to answer that tonight. We can have this discussion on the 19th, or you can answer it tonight. But
didn't you tell me that the agenda for the November 19th is currently sitting at 11:30 p.m. for completion?
It is. It's horrible.
I would like us not to have this conversation on November 19th.
It could be easier than that. I mean, one of the things that we felt like we really needed to ask was there an appetite for option 3? Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's been some discussion about upzoning in certain areas, and that, whether we defer that or put it off or take it on now, that was part of the question. We think that is a big issue that might distract us from some of the lower hanging fruit that we might have with some of the code work. And that was our part of the question here.
Yeah.
I don't want to take our eyes off of a wider policy conversation. I do understand and appreciate, the desire to do this work now, and the low-hanging fruit, as you put it. But, when I look at this map, I certainly don't see like hubs and spokes or whatever, I mean, it's not in alignment with a whole lot of like transportation infrastructure right now.
Right.
I mean, like kind of by accident, maybe not by accident, but, we've got frequent bus lines, for example, that, that run through very low-density neighborhoods, and I want the community to have a conversation about that, because I think that that's, eventually, we're going to have that conversation. It makes absolutely no sense to me, to be running frequent transit lines through, I mean, there's opportunity there, right? There's opportunity for connectivity that we all, want to see. But I also really appreciate the desire, to have this other part of the conversation right now. So I'm okay with one or two. But
Yeah, I mean, I find it very appealing to get the ball rolling, do some minor housekeeping. I think that makes a lot of sense, and absolutely keep an eye on when we might have opportunities to have some bigger conversations about zoning. And I think thinking about those things once the dust has settled a little around HB 2001 makes some sense. I'm not really concerned about that one.
Yeah.
And the TSP, yeah, absolutely. Those two things are going to be big. So in terms of starting to get movement and starting to address a housing crisis, let's do that and keep the door open on some of that bigger picture stuff.
That feels like good direction to us. I'm not sure if we need to come back on the 19th and
Please say no. Please say you don't.
Can you, yeah, we have so much. Can we go back, can we go to your next question? Yeah. So this is actually what I was asking. This is the other piece of what we had out for the second discussion.
Right.
Right, to me, that's the big public discussion. That's what people will care about. The other one, the average person isn't going to care that much about. That is what people will care about, and that's where I think we have a robust public, discourse.
Well, you don't have to necessarily pick one of these right now, but we could go out with both, or we could go out with one.
Oh, I would want to go out with both.
Okay.
I would absolutely not want to go out with number one alone.
What does that do to staff time to present both?
I don't think there's a difference in staff time for
Okay.
this, really. Well, there is. I mean, there is. But it's like,
You'll notice I was being real quiet.
well, I was thinking about what that meant. It was conceptually, there isn't much difference. But if we were writing two different full-on sets of code for both of them, there's.
Well, I mean, I think that I wouldn't be the code writing stage first.
No,
I wouldn't
I'd have
be
the
doing
discussion.
that before you're having the public discussion.
You would have a defined amount
No,
a defined period of time to have this discussion before you then move into the code writing based essentially on a preferred alternative that's based on community input.
Right.
That the council, through some action needs to give their blessing to.
Right.
And so, and yeah, I mean, within both of these, both options 1 and 2, you can have, it doesn't have to be consistent across all zones. Obviously, you can have different requirements for different housing types within the R5 than the R7. You can, there's different ways of doing it.
Or it could even be, you've got a slightly lower density option that goes citywide and a higher density option within House Bill 2001 context for those areas along the corridors. And in fact, the cottage cluster work, the recommendations from the consultant did that. that there was a higher density version of the cottage cluster recommendation when you were closer to transit than when you were further away from transit. So one of our starting points, when we revived that work, it already has that built in a little bit.
So why do you think there would need to be necessarily a minimum lot size if we maintain the green space rule, like you're required to have whatever it is in R7, 60% or 40? I don't remember.
I think that's just an example of what type of standards you might build into that approach.
Because I can imagine somebody taking a 1,000 square foot footprint in a space where you can do a basement, say it's on a hill, so there's a daylight basement, and putting 3 units, got your basement unit, your ground floor unit, and your second floor unit, and it's a 1,000 square foot building.
All in the same footprint of a typical single family.
So,
well, I think that's right. That's why that's why the state, I mean, there was an assumption that you could do that, and that's why House Bill 2001 passed, I think. It is an element of form-based code writing and how you do that. It's like make the multiple units fit the shape and style of the surrounding housing. Well, that's what the art of kind of writing this code is going to be about. It can definitely be done.
Well, I think the minimum lot size is influenced by what we decide to do with minimum off-street parking, what we decide to do with some of the other things that have an impact on the physical use and design of the site. If we still maintain minimum parking for each unit, then you need more off-street parking spaces on the same lot size, and you need different driveway configuration, and so I think that's where something like lot size comes into effect, and so it obviously depends on what we decide to do with some of our other development standards, including off-street parking.
And we've got the forestry objective of 40% tree canopy too, so we got to filter that in and kind of how we
not necessarily requiring that per lot.
No.
I know it's not per lot, but I mean on a
You can't
it's one
achieve it
place
without
to
looking at.
pick it up. You
Yeah.
know?
But if we have a minimum non-covered, minimum, however you want to define it, green space, not hardscaped.
Right.
Right.
But we have eaten away at what that is over the years, and we ate away at it more with, allowing ADUs everywhere. So now that number is not, I think it's ends up being like 40%. It's not over half anymore.
And
On any of the zones?
Well, I don't know, in the bigger zones it might be, but I mean, we had some samples when we'd looked at the ADUs of, here's, the house is this much, the garage over here is this much, and now the ADU's this much, and your lot coverage, your minimum lot coverage. I mean, I think that's all good stuff to discuss, but I mean, I think you're overestimating how much required green space we have under our code.
Example, I don't remember the numbers.
Yeah.
But my point is,
Yeah.
I don't think you need a minimum lot size. I think you just define it by what you can't cover.
Well, and I think you don't need to worry a whole lot about minimum lot size if you do a comprehensive analysis and consideration of all your different development standards. Then, depending on what you're requiring on the site, that's going to dictate how many units can get built. Because if you have off-street parking requirements and you have a 5,000 square foot minimum for a fourplex in the R5, there's probably not going to be a good way to accommodate all 4 units plus the parking on that 5,000 square foot lot, and so it kind of takes care of itself. So it just depends on all the other, development standards extend way beyond just lot size, and so.
But that's
Our
also,
single family,
that's also dependent on setbacks and all the other pieces that we need to have a discussion about.
Right.
and our single family development standards try to create a pedestrian-oriented streetscape with a smaller garage opening, a porch on the front, the windows on the front. So those are things that kind of play into that entire design. If you're going to hold to those design standards for all of these different housing types, that creates a look, at least from the street, that is consistent with the rest of the neighborhood. So those are the challenges.
And I think the design standards are one area where we're going to really need to think about just how we address middle housing, because right now, multifamily design standards apply to anything that's not a single-family home or a duplex. And so when we start applying, if they look just like a home, obviously, do we apply the single-family standards? But within the comp plan policies, within urban design, and with some of the other sections on housing, we have some policy language about expanding permitted designs, not being so prescriptive, not just requiring little craftsman style
Cutters.
Cookie cutters. So
Yeah, today a triplex or a fourplex have got to meet the multifamily standards, not the single-family standards. But if we're putting the units into the neighborhoods where the single-family standards apply, what standards are we supposed to use?
So it sounds like we have the answer on the first question, which is really helpful. This question is harder, and it sounds like you also could probably use some information from staff about all the pieces that would need to be included in the discussion with the community around this question. So parking changes, lot coverage changes, setback changes, anything like that. So,
Well, to me, those are questions that come after this question.
absolutely.
They're not they're not necessary to this question.
Well, they're elements of option one.
They're going to affect the answer to this question.
I think you can't talk about lot size coverage until we have, and we're not asking for all these answers. I know you can't give us all these answers, and we actually do want to get feedback from the community. But I think we need to have a little more information to provide you before we finish this discussion. If you're okay, I'd like to come back also, because we're over time, on the 19th to address this. I know it was really close, and I really appreciate it. But with a little more information around where we went tonight on this question, and we'll talk then.
Okay.
Okay.
all right, well, thank you.
Thanks.
And do we have a package coming on duplexes? Isn't there something we have to pass before the end of the year or something on duplexes?
No, that's on ADUs.
The
The ADUs, we have to get rid of the owner occupancy requirement and the off-street parking requirement for
okay.
ADUs.
Okay.
So that's going to the Planning Commission next week, and then it's coming before you on December 17th.
Okay.
The duplex,
House Bill 2001 driven.
we didn't discuss duplexes tonight because that's something that we have to do. We wanted to focus on the triplex, fourplex, cottage cluster discussion.
Thanks, guys.
Right.
Thank you.
So upon adjournment of the work session, the council will meet in executive session pursuant to Oregon Revised Statute ORS 192.6602H to consult with counsel concerning legal rights and duties regarding current litigation or litigation likely to be filed. So with that, we are adjourned from the work session, and we will be back here for this regular session at 6 o'clock.